and he was put in for, well, as she characterized it, just smoking a joint. I got to tell you, Ann, this is becoming more and more familiar all the time, and I have the same reaction you do when NBC starts telling you, we won't say exactly what it was he was locked up for life for, but it's just something minor. You immediately begin to suspect it's something more than something minor, and in this case, it turns out to be exactly that, doesn't it?
Yes, they have the advantage that it's often hard to look up the details of these cases. It was not in this particular case. And yeah, it's always, we got involved in something, we're not sure what. There's some confusion about what he's in prison for. And, the tough on crime era. The tough on crime era was pretty great. I mean, that's the problem now. People don't realize how awful things were, how blood ran in the streets. Crime used to be a much bigger issue for the Republican Party than taxes, for example. But they did such a good job. The Reagan judges, the Rudy Giuliani policies on crime in New York City. New York City alone was responsible for something like a quarter of all murders in America when Rudy Giuliani came in. But in this particular case, which is what I write about, like I say, I didn't have to go search through the dockets of the court. I just ran a simple Nexus search and got a slew of articles in the New York Times, New York Newsday. This William Underwood being promoted by both presidential candidate Cory Booker and NBC News, their investigative reporter Leanne Caldwell. All we knew about him from Cory and from Leanne was that he was such a good father, and his daughter is lobbying for his release. And he was so good when he was in prison. What he believed was just be a good father, and he's been a mentor to all these people. No, he was the head of the largest heroin gang, spreading heroin throughout Harlem in the 80s. It went on for more than a decade. He was the head of the most violent of the international drug rings terrorizing New York, responsible for, at least in the conviction, it was convicted of 6 murders, but police say, according to the New York Times, that his gang and some of the rival gangs were responsible for hundreds of murders throughout the 80s. I grew up in Connecticut, outside of New York, and oh my gosh, it was like Death Wish in New York. A few years of Giuliani, and now suddenly all these hipster millennials moving into places like Brooklyn and Harlem, which used to be an absolute no-go zone. Remember one of the Kennedy kids was killed in Harlem trying to buy heroin? That's what Harlem was like. Now, expensive restaurants, multi-million-dollar brownstones. Why? Because we got these guys, federal prosecutors, rounded them up, locked them up. The evidence against William Underwood, incidentally, was pretty impressive. Among the people he was convicted of arranging the murder of were witnesses who were going to testify against him. Well, the federal prosecutors had 50 witnesses against him, including some of the men who worked for him, witnesses to some of the murders. There were innocent passersby who ended up being killed, but 50 witnesses. They had some of his guys on tape. Undercover cops would get them talking, and they'd be bragging about the murders they committed for William Underwood. But there's Cory Booker on MSNBC, asked by Leanne Caldwell, investigative reporter. Now, if your bill doesn't pass, that would basically throw everyone out of prison after 10 years. Would you consider granting clemency to William Underwood? Cory Booker, hell yes. It disgusts me that men like Underwood are in prison. No, it disgusts us that someone running for president doesn't know the basics. I hope he doesn't know the basics of what William Underwood is in prison for. Incidentally, I just tweeted moments ago, the big argument of these people like Cory Booker and Jared Kushner is that people age out of committing crime, and it's so cruel to keep people like that in prison. They're not going to commit any more crimes. It's so cruel. I just happen to be flipping through the internet, and a 70-year-old guy who was not sentenced to his full term for his last crime, his first crime, I guess, was murdering his wife. No, he was in his 70s, so a Maine judge said, no, I think he's aged out. It doesn't make any sense penologically to keep him in prison. Well, he just killed another woman. in his 70s. No, criminals don't age out. This is why society has decided that certain people should remain behind bars. And by waiting just a few years, forget 10 years, everyone forgets what the original crime is. It just happens that in this case, William Underwood was such a drug lord of a huge continuing criminal enterprise that it was a big enough story to make the New York Times. A lot of these stories, they don't make nexus. You can't get the details of the crime unless there happens to be an appeal and the appellate court even bothers to issue an opinion. That's why these stories are often difficult to write. Although, as I say, in this case, it took me about 60 seconds on Nexus. But apparently at NBC, they don't have access to the internet.
Well, but, you can imagine this blowing up on some of these candidates like Booker. If a reporter decides to break from the pack and say, Senator Booker, you advocated for clemency for this man. He ran one of the biggest drug rings, responsible for 6 murders, perhaps hundreds of murders, but 6 that we know of, 50 people testifying against him. Why would you want him out of prison? And you would think that kind of question from an enterprising reporter could produce all kinds of great tape for television, but are they all such a pack that they won't ask him the kind of question? Because it seems like it'd make a very sexy story.
Yes, it would. I'm the only unfortunate aspect to my column is that it was only Cory Booker who was lobbying for his release, because I hate to make predictions, but I don't see Cory going anywhere. If he were the nominee, interview the relatives of the victims of this guy, Cory Underwood, or William Underwood, whom Cory Booker says, hell yeah, I'd release this guy. Let's see what the victims' families have to say about that. But it's always this. Go ahead. No,
go ahead.
Well, it's always this sleight of hand. I mean, this is the argument. I was thinking about this. The things that people vote for, Brexit, less immigration, no illegal immigration. Similarly, Americans are constantly voting for the death penalty, no matter how many people weep about it. California just recently had a referendum and overwhelmingly approved the death penalty. These are the things we vote for over and over and over and again, and we can never get. We can just never get them, whether it's immigration or the death penalty or poor Britain trying to leave the EU. You vote and you vote and you vote, and you can never win these issues. But the big argument against the death penalty is, but it's so cruel, we could make mistakes. There is no provable mistake for more than 50 years, by the way. They're all
in the modern era
who's been executed.
Yep.
Yes, and only because we can't go back and check the records before that. Now that at least it's easier to check the records. They say, why not just life in prison without possibility of parole? And then they wait 10 years and they try to spring those guys too.
And as a last thought, Ann, to your column, truth in sentencing. If you tell the community this man, this woman is going away for 30 years, you should hold to the 30 years. And if you don't, then what you've done is you've lied to the community at the time of sentencing, saying, we'll fix it up later. You got to read the column by Ann Coulter and her book, In Trump We Trust, E Pluribus Awesome.